anytime there is an update and they change the design, it gets harder, right? Because your brain is kind of understand and things from that perspective that yes, this is the design that I have learned and I understand it, and it's consistent throughout the application. It's not changing its layout on every page.
Yeah.
So yeah, keeping it consistent throughout the application is what makes sense to me. But while I'm thinking as a user, so yeah, that's the thing.
Okay.
Okay, let's continue. We are already at our time, and this is our 85th, I guess, if I'm not wrong, easy open discussion. And today we will summarize or utilize our knowledge from part one and part two, which was around Graph API and OAuth, in looking at how you can upload or download file from SharePoint using that. So here's a normal, as in if anybody is watching this recording later and they would like to join these meetings, you just need to go to this page and then you see a link to register. You just need to fill up some basic detail and you'll get the invite for the next meeting. Okay. So before we move forward, I haven't committed it yet, but it'll be the part of the repo. And let me see which one is this. Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah, that one, right? This one. Okay. So this will be the part of repo, and I'll zoom this in so that we can see it. And I just did it to save time, because this was pretty straightforward. So what we have done on this one, and I'll commit it in the GitHub so that others can use it. Created a new table for SharePoint setup, and as we discussed earlier, I'm using a prefix as PC open discussion. It's not registered, it's just for these meetings. So you can change it if you are planning to use this. Then there's a primary key to kind of set up table. The application ID, which will take from the application that we'll create in Azure portal, which will store that. Then this will store the secrets for that app, the redirect URL, and we'll talk about it why all these fields are needed. And then there are parameters like site name, which will point to one particular site in SharePoint. As we have briefly gone through it, that there can be one or multiple sites in a SharePoint environment. So this will list down the site name. Then inside a site, as we saw, there are document libraries that are used to store files. So this will be used to identify which library we would like to use. And then inside document libraries, if you are storing multiple documents and then you want to have a separate folder for Business Central, then you can utilize a folder here. And you can go as deep as you want by just extending the structure. As we understood in the previous session, that everything in SharePoint has a primary key of ID. So the site name also have a site ID, which will be just behind the scene if you don't like to see it. Library will also have an ID, and document folder will also have an ID. And then we have an associated page with it, which just shows you allows user to kind of change the setting as we go forward, because the client secret comes up with an expiry date. So the user will have to change it, the administrator of the organization. So that's where this helps. And then this will have the site fields and all. And where is that? Okay, let me see where I am. Okay, yes. So here is the Business Central environment where we'll be publishing it and testing it. And I guess I have published this part already. And just to save time, I have also created an app called PC Open Discussion. As we did in the previous sessions, I have already defined the redirect URL. I have the secret associated to it, and I'll have the application ID and all filled in Business Central as we go through. I haven't defined any permissions or to this. We'll do it as we go through and understand where things are kind of causing errors. It's right now basic user read. Then for the sites, I think I have created a separate site for the demo. This one, and this just have a empty begin page, and then this is the doc folder that we'll use, which is part of one of the document library. So if you see here, where is that? I always get confused. Site content. You will see that there is a document library called Business Central Docs, and this is what we'll use. And then this is what, let me see. Right. So this is the Business Central environment, and I'm pretty sure I did install this app. Yes, it's there. So let's search for our SharePoint Connector page and setup page. So this is how it looks like, an application ID. Let's start filling it in, which is this. Okay. New record, an application ID. I'll have to find the secret, so let me just do that. I would have saved it somewhere. Okay. As we discussed earlier, it's one-time visible, so you'll have to save it. Once it is done, I need to define the Oauth redirect URL, which is here, which is a static URL, and this is just for business and SaaS. For on-prem, it's a different URL which points to your service tier and that page. So this just varies based on where you are trying to connect this. Okay. I don't remember what I did on the Oauth redirect URL. Oh, yes. So for Oauth redirect URL, you'll go here, and then you'll go to the endpoint, and then you will see the Oauth endpoint v2. Okay. This is the authorize, and this is for token. Okay. Let's key in there. These are the settings that are needed to fetch the next token from this. So let's talk about it. This is kind of the basic. And Sandeep said yes. Yeah, something.
The organization in this URL, do we have to change it with the tenant ID? Within the URL, it's https login.microsoftonline/organization.
Right. Let's give it a try. I don't remember what I did, but I'm pretty sure.
Organization has to be replaced with this tenant ID, which is on the left side. Below this application ID, object ID, tenant ID.
Okay, this one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that.
That's how it will be able to identify which tenant it has to go.
Okay,
organizations here. This is as far as I remember I have done.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, I did it for a while ago, so I'm pretty sure I have set it up for a customer. Otherwise, I can go there and check. Okay, so there are two parts of it. One is to kind of see that is it working or not by checking the grants, as in. So if you know this on Business Central, there is a way, and I guess we talked about it, which is the AAD page where you define different application, and then you grant consent for it based on it. This one is an action called grant consent, which kind of grants permission through it. What we'll try to do is we'll try to simulate this on our environment so that we don't have to go to the separate page. We'll add a grant consent on our application page. So for that, let's utilize what Microsoft has done. and let's understand which this page is. Okay. This is our page 9861. So let's go into our business center environment and let's try to figure that out. Okay, I hope it's here. No. System application. Yeah. This one page. No, it seems on the base app. All right, there it is. Now let's directly go into that action and let's just try to copy it as it is. Okay, let me do the whole action thing from here. Copy it and let's put it in our page. Yes. I don't need it enable, it will be enabled by default, and then there seems an action written on the table itself, associated table, which is 9012. That way at least we'll say 12, and then we'll try to understand what that is doing. So there should be a procedure of grant consent. It's not here, so maybe it's in the page again, which is the 961. Here it is. It says scope on-prem, which is, it does not make any sense. There's nothing that will make it only. Let's copy this and let's paste it in our table. I like to keep methods in table itself. And because it's on table, I'll have to remove the local so that it can be utilized there. Okay, so it seems that there is a code unit for Oauth called Oauth 2. And we'll find something from it, for sure. And then it refers to a object called Graph Management General Tool, okay? Which okay. Okay, let's have a reference of it. Somewhere here of my code unit of management and general tools.
It has gone up.
And up.
Yeah, here it is.
Okay, there it is. What this code unit is trying to do, let's understand that. Let's problem here. It's trying to strip the brackets from the client ID, which in our case is application ID. Okay,
Saurabh, what was that? Yeah. What was that warning you shifted that variable to up?
That's just the placement of how the variables should be ordered. So when you place some, sorting order. So when you place it on the wrong position, it tells you where it should be. The first one comes as the record. The second order is report, then code unit, and then so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
That's just how Microsoft like to kind of keep the code. Okay, so then it is the common OAuth URL label. And Sandeep sir, here is my confusion, I guess. So let's go into 9861 because this application is utilizing the standard Microsoft application is utilizing is static OAuth URL, which does not seem to pointing to it. To a specific tenant. So let's search for that. It says this.
Yeah.
right? Which is a little bit confusing why Microsoft will do it if it is supposed to be pointing to an environment,
It
because
is
it's a
basically admin consent page standard. So there will be one more variable that will be passed, I believe.
okay. Let's check it out. We'll replace it with our OAuth return URL, which we have already defined here, called OAuth redirect URL. Okay. And then there's a success message, which is returned, it seems, and error message, which is local. Okay. What happens with this is request the permission from a directory admin, and then it returns you is the grant has been done, which is has the grant consent succeeded, and then the permission grant error. So these two are returned in case of failure to identify success or not. And if it is not success, then it generates the error message, whatever it is. Otherwise, it generates a static message of consent failure error. Let's see what those are, and let's copy them as it is. Here, right? We don't have any permission granted thing, and we don't want to modify. We just want to see is that going to that environment or not. That will verify that our action is behaving the way we would like it to behave. So let's republish this, and I'll do it on cloud so that we can check it here. What's happening? Okay. Once it gets published, we will understand that is our integration to OAuth, so as the Azure server is working or not, because it will grant that consent if required, if everything wins that's correctly. Okay, as in it is not supposed to be doing like this until unless it's a sandbox environment or a test environment where you're doing this. For a SaaS environment, you should always get your app from the pipeline with all the processes that are supposed to be running. This is just a demo. Don't just follow it as it is if you're building your apps for your customer. Okay. So now we have defined our things, and if everything goes well, we should not. Oh, did I? Yeah, there's a message, I guess, at the end. The OAuth window came, but it says that the endpoint only accept post option received a GET request. Just
Maybe replace that application ID with the organization only. Let us check.
this one? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see that. Okay. It will be authorized in this case, I guess.
But token.
Token?
You're getting token, right?
I'm right now just trying to authorize this app, more or less.
Grant consent. Okay.
Yeah. Let's paste it. Okay. The request body must contain the following parameter as scope. So it needs something called as scope to kind of validate this, more or less. That seems the problem in this piece. And why is that? Because it was not. Didn't we define? Let's go back to our thing. So it says, and we just copied everything what Microsoft had. That go there, and then strip the brackets, get the application ID out of it, and then the OAuth redirect URL, success, and error message.
Can we use some Microsoft Oauth redirect URL? The which Microsoft has given.
Yeah, let's try that. Which is this? Right, common consent. Okay, let's copy this. Plug in this here. Okay, and then utilize this here.
In fact, this is what I've also used. Admin consent.
Okay. Should I publish this? But this will be common to every environment, right? This one is pretty common.
But you are sending the application ID, no? It will recognize.
Yeah. And based on my business center tenant, it will also know my tenant more or less.
No, even on-prem, if I'm sending my application ID, then it will be able to identify.
Right. Okay, because once it is done, then we'll start the next part, which is mapping it to the SharePoint. So this will verify that at least our connection to later what we will use to kind of get the tokens from the OAuth will work if this kind of gets validated. Okay, let's have a look. Let's do the grant consent. Okay, this time it popped up. And now it says that this application or this is not published by Microsoft. It's a third-party application which you have created. And right now it's requesting you to assign permission for sign in and read user profile. Because if you remember here, what I've shown you, that it has just a basic permission at this moment, which is the user read. And if you look at it right now, there is no consent given. So technically speaking, it cannot do that if it needs it to do it. And this thing is done by administrator, which is allowing this app, which is not created by Microsoft, to verify that yes, I accept this app and I know who created it. So let this app allow to do that. So now if I refresh this page, this should change to yes. Okay, it's taking a while. It should automatically refresh more or less. Some last time also it took some time. So let's wait for that. But okay, now we know that our grant consent is done and it granted. Once I click on that, okay, I guess that committed the transaction. So now our interaction between our business central environment and our app in Microsoft Azure is happening. So now we are sure about moving toward the next step. So now let's talk about what we'll have to do on the site name. So at the end of the day, whenever a user inputs or whenever an administrator, this page will be majorly dealt by administrator, will provide a site name. We'll have to kind of validate this against SharePoint, and if it is found, we'll then have to fetch the ID of that particular site, because anything that we have to do after this point will require that ID to be validated. Questions? Okay. So for that, we'll go back to Microsoft Graph. Because that's our friend when we deal with any Microsoft API that we would like to use. We'll go to the Graph Explorer. Now, if you look on these basic templates that are provided by Microsoft, there is a separate section which talks about SharePoint sites. And then it tells you that, oh, if you want to get the default site, you should use this URL and it will return you the default site. What we are trying to do is we are not trying to find the default site, we're trying to find a specific site. You'll have to maybe read a little bit about these URLs, about SharePoint and all, but if you have to search a site in the graph, what you have to change this URL to is that I would like to search a site and then give its name. So the site name here is this. When I run this query, it will return me the results as the details of that site if that site is found, which is this site. The web URL for it, and then this is the unique ID for this site in the SharePoint space. So now what we will have to do is, as soon as somebody enters a site name like BC open discussion in this column, that need to be validated to see is that site found or not. And if it is found, then we'll have to fetch the ID so that we can proceed to the next step. Because if I have to find document libraries inside this site, so first I'll have to reach the site and then target to the document libraries. Okay. So now let's try to code it in our business center. We know this is the URL that we have to target. And we know that our connection to Azure is working with the Oauth thing. So let's tweak this or change it the way we want it. So here we are on the site name. I've already done some basic code, which is if the site name is changed to blank by a user, then automatically these document libraries and the folder should also change to blank, so that when it refreshes, it kind of doesn't keep the old value. But now what we need is, we know where is that URL. Let me pick that up. This is the URL that I'm trying to target or call, more or less. So what I'll have to do here is I'll have to define this as a URL. Let's trigger somewhere. So let's say SharePoint, or let's do it simple, site base URL as a variable here, and that will be a label pointing to this path, where I'll change this large part as a parameter and pass it under typical purpose of code. Okay, this is, if you don't know this, anytime you specify a %1, %2, you also have to add something called as comment, specifying what that %1 or 2 means. That's where, after a while, this should go away. And this is right now unused, so that's why we're seeing this. Okay, so this is the code when the site name is blank. What if the site name have a value? We would like to send this to, let's say, code unit or somewhere where this will give me what I want, which is my site ID should be filled in, and then I should utilize that. So let's create a code unit also. And let's call it file. Okay, SharePoint management code unit. Okay, let me just create it for the one and name it as POD SharePoint. Okay, so we'll have all our integration code here, but then what we want here is to, let's define this variable also here. SharePoint code unit. Okay. Let's define first what we need from it. So we will need get ID, let's say, get SharePoint ID. And then we need it to give the site name, which we just received from user. And in return, we need a site ID. Keep it simple. We'll just start with this and see how it goes. So we need to create a method which accepts 2 parameters here. So let's do that here. So this with SharePoint ID, and then what we need is the site name as text, and what we need is site ID, which is of type text. Okay. Text. This will be a return. Must declare a body, not a body. But we also need the base URL that we have just defined here, which is this one. Because based on this, it will start using this. So instead of site name, we should actually pass the site base URL along with the site name. So let's change it to substitute the string where we do the site base URL with the site name. This will convert it to the URL to be called. Okay, so URL, let's say. And then we need the site ID, which is this. So far, so good. Okay. So let's say this as first URL, and then this becomes our URL that will travel, and then we'll return the site ID. So now what we need to do here is to call that HTTP method and get the return value out of it. Right. So we have done it, I guess, previously, which starts with a HTTP client variable. Then we need the headers to be passed out of with the request, which becomes the HTTP headers. Then we have a request message that we are sending to the client, which is HTTP request message. And when we call this request message, the call returns and response, which is of type a response message. So we'll get a response out of it, which will be the HTTP response message. This more or less is required for any call that you're doing outside of Business Central. So the first part is creation of the headers, which will be the default in this case. It may change based on what you're calling, but if you're in the Microsoft space, most of the application accepts the default header that kind of gets added. And the next thing in the header that we have to add is called as authorization. And that's where our Oauth comes into picture. We'll park it. In the previous version, like Business Central 18 or Business Central 19, you can add authorization as basic, where you can send the username and password, and it just generates that. What next after that? Then in the request message that you are sending, we have to send or set the request URI or URL that we want to invoke, which is our past URL that we have generated. Okay. Once it is set, then you also have to define what kind of request it is. So if you see here, we are doing a GET request to find out that info, is it available or not. So you can always define what kind of request message it is. So you can say request message dot method as GET. And all these GET put are also available here. You can just drill down here and see what are the options are here based on whatever type of operation you are doing against that call. Once you have defined the header, defined the authentication, given a URL, now what you do is using the HTTP client, you just call that. Say client.send. If you see the parameters of send, it's just the request which is the request message. And then in the reply, it's a response. And then it returns you a Boolean. So you can say if the client send happens with two parameters. One is the request message, which I have set here. And in return, I would like to get the response in my response message and do something, or otherwise generate an error message at the end of it. If it returns, if the call is successful, the response message contains everything that you get out of it. Either it's a success or a failure, everything will be kind of stored inside the response message. So now we'll have to query this response message. The response message also comes up with a success code. Is the request that we made is successful or failure? Because if it's a failure, then there's no point scanning it further. If it is a success code, then you do something and then figure out what that is. Otherwise, we can just generate an error message. So let's say error, and then we can give it an error message that we would like, more or less. Let's say, which is something like unable to access URL, error return, error code return, error status code is %1. This will be able to show what kind of error was generated when we were trying to do this. And then because we have defined this, let's also define the response message dot status code. Whatever the error will be, that will be displayed here. And just to be removing the error things, extract it to label and we'll call it as error status text. It's at the top. We'll put it on the bottom. All right. Now, what happens if everything that is responded is a response as a success? How we deal with that? Then comes up the part of the JSON, because any response that we are getting from my call is a JSON string. So now what we can do is we can start reading this response using a JSON, which will be something like my response message that I received have some content, and then if I would like to read it, there are different kind of overloads that are available here at this point, which is you can read it as a string. You can also read it as in a string. So we'll prefer reading it as a string more or less. That will become my response text. So let's put it here. Whatever comes in the response, the JSON will convert it to the string by using this method. And then I can surely read it from here. Just, I can say JSON response. Where is that? My JSON response. Oh, this is converted to this, which is a text. But this whole text is in form of a JSON, as we were talking. So let's define that so that we can read that. JSON object. So this will then start here to kind of read it from it as read from, and then you can again utilize same text which you have utilized. So now at this point, the whole response is in this JSON object per se. And just to keep it simple at this point, we should, in that case, if it is a success, just do a message to see what kind of JSON response we are getting. It was a text, I guess, which extracts it to the text. Try to. Okay, see the overloads available to a string and to an out string. Okay, let's maybe keep it simple. If we can, then just don't read it here, and let's show it on the response text. What happens?
Well, do you have to read it as a text? Because response text is set as text. Can you not
Yes,
just?
that's all. Yeah, I just converted it to commented this part and displayed this.
Okay, good.
Okay, so now let's come to the biggest question in this whole equation, which is about the authentication that we need to set, which happens here, which you haven't done. What we'll have to do is we'll have to get the access token from SharePoint, more or less. And that we will write in a generic space, which may be here. So what happened to this? Okay, let's see what happened to this. It says text 1024. Why it is 1020? Okay, just keep the text. Oh, because this is local. That does that. Oh, and then this new thing about implicit with. Text to text 014. Okay, done. Okay, so let's start working on getting the SharePoint token, or sorry, the access token for the SharePoint that we'll have to use for our authorization to our call. So once we have done the grant consent, we know based on this that there is actually a code unit which deals with the Oauth things. So let's try to create a method which just is there for fetching the tokens from my Oauth environment or access token from my app. So let's say get access token. Now, if I utilize the same code unit, which is here, OAuth2, I should find something in this which will help me to kind of fetch the token. If you see here, there is a lot of function. Let's quickly go through this code unit if we can. Yes. So if you read through the definition more or less about this table, this code unit, there are multiple methods available to kind of fetch the token, which require certain parameters, which is the client ID, which we have, the client secret, which we have, the OAuth URL for authority, authorization. So we'll have to pick the OAuth authorization URL. Then there is a redirect URL, which is used when something is processed successfully, where it should go back. Then there is a resource URL. We'll talk about it, what that is. Promote prompt interaction. Now, this is very important about the prompt interaction when you are dealing with code that you are building, which happens behind the scene, like which runs on your job queue, let's say, more or less. And then there's an access token which is written, and then there is an authentication code error if happens. So you can spend time and read this because there are so many methods which have different types, different variants to acquire token based on different parameters. With certificate, then there is something with this, and then there are different parameters that you have used. What I've understood after working on it is that the first thing that is in all of these calls will need to define a scope, and the scope is the limit that this app can kind of get access to. It's limiting that app. So to define a scope, you'll have to define a variable for it, which is, let's say, list of text. Why this is a list of text? Because you can have one or more scope. Not in this scenario, but in general, when you're doing other interactions with your SharePoint, or for that matter, anything else, where you have to limit your call, if you remember our OAuth discussion, when the call goes from the client to the resource server, it defines what kind of scope this app has. And that can be one or multiple. So you can just keep on adding the scopes that you need for your application to kind of move forward. Now, in general, for SharePoint, just to keep it simple, we'll use the standard that I'm using the graph API. So I just need the specific domain permission which are around the graph. And you can just read it on MSDN when you're trying to interact with SharePoint, what kind of scopes you need to define. This is one very common, which is used when you're dealing with the graph API default. Once you have done that, now there are two parts of it. One is the first time when you user is interacting with the system, which happens something like this, where you do a OAuth and then you use kind of acquire token by authorization code. Acquire token, let me write it because there are so many authorization code. This one is a very common use case to kind of fetch the tokens from. And we'll have to add one more, and I'll tell you why. Now, if you read through it, there are some specific parameters that it needs, which is the client ID, the client secret, the OAuth redirect URL, the default redirect URL. Then it says resources, and then it says prompt interaction, and we'll understand those, and access token and authorization error. But I think this one is deprecating, if I'm not wrong. Let me see. There are two like this. This one is for the scope. Okay. So initially, yeah,
there's one more.
Yeah, there is one more which is with the scope. So yeah, there are two variants of it, and which is they name the same, but they have different parameters more or less. This one is one with the resource server, and then this one is with the scopes. So in the previous version of Business Central, more or less, there was the old one which needed you to provide the resource URL, and that gives you access to just those resources. The newer method or the future method that you will be using is based on the scope that you have defined, and you should be using that one because the older one will be truncated or removed in a while, and that doesn't make sense to use the old one. So let's start defining those parameters. The first one is the client ID. So we have already defined it here. Let's pick it as it is. Let's try to use what Microsoft was using. And just to keep it simple, what I'll do is I'll just make it global. So once we have the application ID, the second part that we need on this one is the client secret, which I guess we also use here, if I'm not wrong. No, we didn't. Okay, so let's try to use that. Secret. The next thing that we need here is the OAuth authority URL. So we will check that. And then the next one is the redirect URL, which is we have a redirect URL, I guess. Yes. Then we need not the resource one, we needed the other one, which will be the scopes thing. So once we have the redirect URL, after that there will be the scopes thing. Scopes. Okay, and let me press enter here so that we can start seeing everything that's there. Okay. So I have given the application ID, we have given the client secret, the redirect URL for OAuth, and the redirect URL for our app, and then we have defined the scopes. Then the next thing it's asking is for prompt interaction. Now this is very important because prompt interaction is what's needed to raise that window of what kind of prompt you are getting. What Microsoft have done is in the prompt interaction, they have created an enum for it. So this. Now this has some predefined options as it's an enum, which is no prompt, which means it happens behind the scene, which actually does not work because you need to authorize it. Then there's a login prompt, which will ask you to re-authenticate as a user. It will ask you for your username and password. Then there's a select account where you can select one of the account if you have multiple. Then there's a consent one, and then there's an admin consent. So the admin consent, we can't choose it because it's just limiting for the administrator, while the app will be used or the custom will be used by different users in the organization. Yes, sir. Sandeep, sir.
If you have authorized using admin consent, then none will work.
Yes, because it's per user, they need to authorize those resources more or less, right?
Okay, but if you have used the admin consent one time, if you have defined that for the organization you're doing it, then none will work because you don't have to authorize every time.
Yes, and I guess I did a different way. Let's talk
Fine.
about that. Let's understand. Maybe what you're saying is correct. Maybe I was doing my thing, and maybe I'm wrong, which is okay. We'll learn that. So what I did at this point is I used the select account prompt interaction, and I'll tell you why. Why? Once you have the scope defined, let's define prompt interaction as the select account. And then the next parameter is the access token. And let's assume that the access token is something that's kind of returned from this function. Access token is X. So the access token then comes as the next parameter. And then the last but not least is the error, the auth code error, the authorization error that we get, if there is any error. Okay, and let's define it again as text. What will happen with this is this will either return us the access token or an error message per se. So now let's see. The result would be that if my access token, which is supposed to be written from this, is blank, then I need to show an error based on whatever is generated into the auth error, more or less. Something like that. Or let me write it down something, because sometimes authorization error comes as blank. Error returned. Say auth errors. Okay. Now, with this prompt, as Sandeep sir was saying, it will raise a pop-up which need to be authorized. But when you think about an application or a code that you're writing, you also would like to keep in mind that there might be a situation where my customer would like to run it behind the scene. Maybe something is happening where files need to be read or write from SharePoint via job queue and things like that. This method will not work because it will require someone to click that action. Or as Sandeep said, either you can do a admin consent one time for the organization, and that way it doesn't kind of break, more or less. But inside this code unit, if you start looking at it, there is one more thing called acquire the same token, authorization token, from cache. So what happens in this case, if you as a user have authorized it for the first time, and then that token is kind of access token is stored in the cache, and if the token in the cache is expired, it automatically behind the scene calls for a refresh token automatically without a prompt. perspective that if for the first time user have authenticated it and approved it and given consent for it, he will not have to repeat it again and again, because now that info is stored that this user have given the consent, and you don't need to call the prompt again and again, because this can happen behind the scene from the cache. So Sandeep sir, maybe let me know if it makes sense or not. What I did is I said, for the first time, try to fetch it from the cache. If you don't find it from the cache, then go and try to fetch it. That means that user have not approved it yet. And I said, if it is not blank, then exit. Otherwise, if it is blank, then go and ask user for his consent and then give him the token out of it. Sandeep sir, does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And the problem with this is, whenever you call the success token, it is for a very short duration. The refresh token that is called, that is for a longer duration. So that can even, the refresh token can even last months altogether. But when the first original token is fetched, that is only for I believe 3000 seconds something.
Yeah, but with this, what was happening when I built it, let's talk about that, is the prompt was not visible because this was automatically this was done once, and the system knows that the user have authorized this, right? So when this one, because if you read about this part, it actually then checks that the token is available in the cache or not, and if it is not, it actually goes and fetches the new token,
Which will be a refresh token, right?
right. Let me
It has
see
to
where
be refresh.
where is this Oauth implementation variable is. Yes, implementation. Open that. Yeah, close this. Okay. Okay, so it initialize and then it checks with the cache credential. And yeah, I did went it in it. If the cache token is expired, it calls the refresh and gets you the new token, which then saves. For me, it saved the prompt, right? And
Okay.
for the first time user clicks on it, he or she actually authorizes that app to kind of have permission to do things. And the next time, whenever that user tries to use the system, it automatically calls this and returns the access token out of it. You don't have to kind of call that again and again, more or less.
Okay. I will test it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm not getting time to test it.
Yeah, not a problem. I'll just make sure that the code goes in the repo today. And then, yeah, surely give it a try and help us. Okay, so before we call the day, let's complete this part. Where is that code unit? Okay, let's finalize this authorization. And this authorization will then need something called as bearer. There is a specific pattern which goes with the bearer percentage one, where the bearer and then there is a access token, more or less. So we are here with the thing, and let's try to add into this str substitute string number, and we'll do the bearer UO label, and then in that we'll use our table, which we haven't added reference. SharePoint setup. We'll use this, and then we'll say dot get access token. And that's it. This line, if everything works well, this will return me the access token. That will set this header up. Once this header is set, it'll send the past URL, which we have. And based on that, it will call the method get that we need. And then it will send that request. And based on it, it will receive the response, and which should show us what we need from it. So let's quickly test it out. And then I forgot to update my visit has been cancelled, so we will meet next week. I'm not going this.
Should I congratulate or?
Yes, be happy. Yes, and that's okay. I'm happy staying home, so that's okay in any case. Yeah, it's good to travel, but nah, for some reasons it got cancelled. And that's okay. Okay. We are here on this one. We did try that thing, and let's try to validate when I do my site name here, which is this one. See what happens. Invalid URI. The URI is empty. Right? Why it is empty? It should generate a URI. Did we write something wrong? Okay, here we are. Let's go up. We said if it is equals to blank, if it is not equal to blank, then substitute the string with the site base URL, which is this, and then refresh it or assign the site ID to it. Anybody see what I'm doing wrong here?
Looks okay.
Yeah. So it substitute this and then it passes this. Let's debug this at this point. Don't do any scenarios, but let's test it out. Okay.
Well, maybe you should try it without the substring, without it.
I need to
Just
replace. I need to add the site ID into it, right? Kind
yeah,
of
but just
see.
message it out to the user so we see if there is a value actually.
Oh, let's test it out quickly as it is getting published. Okay. Why it got stopped? I said debugging. Did I set Control F5 in hurry? Let me do F5. Okay. Sending request. Okay. Okay. Search for it. Put it there. Let's pick the name. Paste it here. Let's come back to debugger. So the past URL is graph API site PC open discussion. Okay. Now let's. Oh, there should be a pop-up here for authorization. Okay. Maybe here is the problem. Let's see. I've done. Okay. Done that. Okay. Here it is giving an error, I guess. Let's see in the center environment. Yes, it says the invalid URI. The URI is empty. Which URI is empty?
Have you done the get
Sorry?
application ID from where it is getting?
Oh, it's a current rec. It's in the same table.
But you have not passed a rec, right? Rec must be empty.
Is it? It's in the same scope.
You have
It's a set of
just
table,
write find
right?
first. A table has been called without a reference to a rec. Can't we do just a find first before this?
Let me just continue this and redo this. Let's see what you're saying. Is it generating the values or not? Refresh. Okay. Okay. Step into. At this point, the application ID. Oh, yeah, that's bad. Okay, might have to do what you're saying here, which is
We
okay.
rec.get or find first. Both will work.
Okay, let's try it out. I should do it on the debug mode. If something goes wrong, I should have something to test out. Okay, let's search for it. Okay. It's empty. Okay. Right. Now, yes, it have values. So let's run through it. Let's see what happens. Okay. Okay. So this time it did call me in the second one to kind of authorize. Once I authorize this moves here, and now it calls the API call. That is done. And let's see what's written out of it. The second thing that you will see for the first time when you're doing a extension which have an API call is this window pop up. There's a way to kind of eliminate it on the extension management window where you can allow the HTTP request to happen. So always allow. So go ahead and return an error message, which is the status code of 403.
This is because we have to replace that URL with the tenant ID.
No, that did happen. What the 403 means here is yeah, I don't have access. My app which I'm utilizing don't have defined access to kind of fetch the token or to call this area of business central. So if you see, it says 403 forbidden, which means everything else in the code is correct, but I don't have access to that particular area with the application that I'm using, which is in this application, I haven't defined the permission to read the sites.
SharePoint site.
Yeah, SharePoint site. So what is the kind of the solution? And that's why we said we'll kind of keep on adding as we go through forward. Is for this app now I know that when I have to access a site, I'll have to find that area. Where is that? SharePoint. There used to be SharePoint area. Yeah, SharePoint. And then I'll have to define here that what I'm doing using this. Okay. So if you come here, then right now I will define that it have a all sites read permission. So even if
Sorry to interrupt, but are you going to give delegated or admin permission? Application permission?
because I am consenting it with the user, I can do that, right? Or a background, yeah, with the sign in user demo, I can also do that. So let's understand the whole thing as in what I'm trying to why I didn't do it in the beginning is any app that you will build is just not defining the application ID, generating a secret out of it, and then running through it. Is also defining what the permission that app has. Can it does the site read? Because your code right now is trying to read all the sites that are available in the SharePoint. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to do this and then kind of read on our flow which will then allow it to kind of read those sites, which right now is not granted yet, right? So I'll just go back into my Business Central and go back to my code, which is here. Continue this. Okay, and let's stop this one. Now, going back here, there were some errors and things like that. But now if I do a grant consent as an administrator here, this permission will be consented or granted to this based on, it'll show, and if you notice the pop-up will change, it'll tell you that what else has been changed. It says now it can read all site collection in SharePoint. We want to allow it. And I said, yes, please do allow it. And that consent was given successfully. Let's refresh this here, and we'll see that the consent in a while will be given, more or less. So now if I try to key in the site name here, it is allowed. And again, there is an error. So there is surely another area which is missing in this where I need to define that permission. And maybe, sir, is that I'm a little bit confused, Sandeep sir, all the time. What is the difference?
I'm super confused in both this.
Right? This one is a little bit confusing to me. Maybe this will solve it. I don't know. Let me see that. Okay. Let me grant directly from here. Okay. This is done. Okay. Now let me try to redo this here. Okay, there is still an access URL 403. Okay, so I'll see what else is missing, and then we'll continue this next week as we're meeting. What the whole idea after this is to kind of set this up, get a site ID here, same way, get a lookup on the document folder, choose a document folder, get the ID here, same for the document libraries and all. And after that, you can just do a simple upload and downloads of file once you know where you have to place them. So what we are trying to do is this, and I guess this will make sense. We try to identify the permission as we go through, then we give a granted and consent action for this. Then we get the access token only here, and then we get the sites. Then we'll get the document library and document folder, and at the end of that, we will know how to kind of upload those files into SharePoint directly. So yeah, if you're listening to this recording again, we are meeting next week, and we'll take it forward from there. Sandeep sir, I'll do commit this code in the Git repo, the same Git repo. Yes. And if you get time, just play it out with this.
Yeah.
See how things goes. Okay. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Saurabh. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh.
Thank you.